The city was alive that evening, full of lights, cars, and people hurrying about their business. Expensive restaurants lined the streets, their glass windows glowing warmly, giving passers-by a view of laughing diners enjoying meals that cost more than some could earn in a week. Outside one of these restaurants, the night air was sharp with the bite of cold wind, a reminder that not everyone belonged to the comfort inside. She stood on the edge of the sidewalk, her coat too thin to keep away the chill, her hands wrapped tightly around herself. Her shoes were worn, the leather cracked, and her hair was tied back in a way that tried to hide its roughness. To most people passing, she was invisible, just another shadow blending into the night. But hunger had a way of pushing down pride, and tonight her empty stomach was louder than her fears. Inside the restaurant, a man sat alone at a table by the window. He was a figure who drew glances not because of his smile or warmth, but because of the air he carried. His suit was tailored, his watch polished, and his posture calm. He was a man used to control, to power, to being noticed. He was a millionaire, a businessman who had built a name for himself as someone sharp, ambitious, and untouchable. People respected him, some feared him, and many envied the life he had carved out of steel determination and endless work. But at that moment, he wasn't thinking about business. He was finishing his dinner, a perfectly cooked meal plated with precision. He ate slowly, sipping his wine, his mind wandering through contracts and investments even as he chewed. To him, the food was nothing extraordinary. It was another dinner in another expensive place, one of hundreds he had experienced. Through the glass window, her eyes fell on the plate he was about to leave behind. The half-eaten meal looked like a feast to her. She swallowed hard, her pride screaming at her to keep walking, but her hunger fighting back. She had gone days on little more than stale bread, stretching every coin she had. Tonight she could not ignore the twisting pain in her stomach. She stepped closer to the restaurant entrance, her heart pounding. She knew people often turned away, annoyed or even cruel when someone like her asked for help. She had learned to accept rejection with a quiet nod and move on. But tonight she hoped just a little that maybe someone would hear her, really hear her. When the man rose from his table, preparing to leave, she gathered what little courage she had left. She walked forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. May I have your leftovers, sir?" The words hung in the air, almost too soft to be heard over the noise of the restaurant. But he heard them. He turned, his brows narrowing slightly as his eyes met hers through the glass. At first, his instinct was to brush it off, to give her the plate and walk away. That would have been the easiest thing. Yet, something in her voice stopped him. It wasn't loud, it wasn't begging, it was careful, almost apologetic, as if she feared even asking was too much. He stepped outside, carrying the bag that held what remained of his meal. She stood a little back, ready for him to hand it over quickly and move on. But when he looked directly at her, really looked, he didn't see just a woman in need. He saw eyes that carried a quiet storm, a history written in silence. They were not the eyes of someone broken beyond hope. They were tired, yes. They were hungry. But they also held a light that spoke of someone who had once stood tall, someone who had not given up entirely. For a moment, he froze. He wasn't a man who believed in fate or miracles, he believed in numbers, in effort, in results. But staring at her, he felt something stir that had long been buried under years of chasing wealth. It was a memory, perhaps of his own younger days when he too had known what it was like to be overlooked, to wonder if tomorrow would be kinder than today. The silence stretched, the city moving on around them, while they stood locked in that quiet exchange. She lowered her eyes, embarrassed for having asked. "I'm sorry," she murmured, almost ready to turn away. But he spoke, his voice calm yet curious. "What did you say?" She looked up again, hesitant, her throat dry. "I was just asking, if I could have your leftovers." He studied her, and for the first time in years, he didn't see the world in terms of transactions. He saw her as a person, not a request. And something inside him whispered that this moment was different. This was not about food. It was about seeing someone that everyone else had ignored. The bag in his hand suddenly felt small, inadequate. What was half a meal compared to the story behind those eyes? He could have handed it over and walked away, and she would have been grateful. But he knew, without understanding why, that if he did, the moment would pass like smoke, leaving behind only regret. So instead of handing her the bag, he asked a question he himself didn't expect. "Have you eaten properly today?" She blinked at him, surprised. No one had asked her that in a long time. "Not really," she admitted softly. He nodded once, his decision already made. "Then come inside." Her eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly. "No, sir, I don't belong in there. I just wanted the leftovers, that's all." But he held her gaze steadily, his voice firm yet kind. "You asked me. Now let me answer properly. Come inside." For a long second, she hesitated, fear and shame pulling her back. But the warmth in his tone, the way he spoke not with pity but with quiet insistence, made her steps move forward almost against her will. She followed him into the restaurant, where heads turned, some with surprise, some with disapproval. But he didn't care. For once, he wasn't living by the expectations of others. And so began a moment that would change both their lives, born not from grand plans, but from a simple question spoken in the cold night air: "May I have your leftovers, sir?" The restaurant was warm, filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. The moment she stepped inside, she felt out of place, as if every eye turned toward her worn coat and tired shoes. The polished marble floor, the golden lights, the fragrance of rich meals, it all felt like another world, a world she didn't belong to. She thought about running back outside, where the cold was familiar and the shadows were kinder than these stairs. But the man walked ahead of her calmly, as though nothing about this situation was unusual. His presence carried a kind of authority that silenced any judgment. Waiters who might have frowned stayed quiet, unsure but obedient. He gestured toward a corner table and asked her to sit. She hesitated, her hands trembling, but finally lowered herself into the seat, her heart racing. He sat across from her, watching her with the same quiet curiosity as before. To her, he seemed untouchable. His suit, his watch, his calm expression all spoke of a life she could never imagine. She kept her eyes low, afraid to meet his gaze again. She had only wanted his leftovers, a small act of mercy. Now she was here, seated in a place she had never thought she'd enter, across from a man who was a stranger yet somehow familiar in the way he made her feel seen. A waiter approached, confused, but the man's voice was steady. "Bring her a proper meal. Hot soup, bread, and something warm for the main course. And tea." Her lips parted in protest. "No, sir, I can't. I don't want to trouble you. I only asked for the food you were going to leave." He shook his head. "What you asked for was enough to make me stop. But what you deserve is more than scraps." His words were simple, but they hit her harder than she expected. No one had spoken to her that way in a long time. She blinked rapidly, trying to hide the sting of tears. She didn't want to cry, not here, not now. She had learned to swallow her emotions like stones, to carry them in silence. The waiter left, and for a moment, there was only the sound of her breathing, quick and uneven, and his steady gaze across the table. Finally, he spoke again, softer this time. "What's your name?" She hesitated. Names had become heavy things for her, reminders of a life she had lost. But she answered quietly, almost in a whisper. "Elena." He repeated it once, as if testing how it felt. "Elena." Then he nodded. "I'm David." She gave a faint nod, her eyes still fixed on the table. She wanted to ask why he was doing this, why he cared at all. But her pride held her back. She had been disappointed too many times, promised kindness only to have it pulled away. It was safer not to hope. When the food arrived, the smell alone made her eyes sting again. A steaming bowl of soup, fresh bread with butter melting into it, and a main dish that looked almost too beautiful to touch. She stared at it, afraid that if she reached out, someone would take it away. David gestured toward the food. "Go on. Eat." She picked up the spoon slowly, her hands still trembling. The first sip of soup was so warm, so rich, that she had to close her eyes. It was the first real food she had tasted in days, maybe weeks. Bite after bite, she ate as though she feared the bowl would vanish if she stopped. But even in her hunger, she remained quiet, careful, her manners intact. There was dignity in the way she ate, as though she refused to let hardship strip her completely of who she once was. David noticed this. He had met many people in his life, business partners, rivals, wealthy acquaintances, but few had carried themselves like this woman, who had nothing, yet held on to a kind of grace that money could not buy. It unsettled him. He was used to seeing desperation, greed, ambition. But in her, he saw something else, something that reminded him of the fire he once carried before success dulled it into routine. As she ate, he asked gently, "How long has it been like this for you?" She paused, lowering her spoon. Her instinct was to say nothing, to protect herself. But his tone wasn't sharp, it wasn't prying. It was steady, as though he truly wanted to know. "Too long," she finally said. Her voice was low, almost fading into the hum of the restaurant. One thing happened after another. I used to work, I used to have a place of my own. But then, life doesn't always listen when you plan it. My mother got sick. I lost my job. The debts," she trailed off, shaking her head. "It all went away so fast. One day you think you're standing, and the next day you're on the ground. And when you fall, people walk past you like you were never there." Her words carried no bitterness, only a quiet truth. She wasn't asking for pity. She was simply telling him what her life had become. David leaned back slightly, her words stirring something old in him. He remembered his early years, when success had felt like an impossible dream. He had worked endlessly, clawed his way up, and now he lived in the comfort of his achievements. But he had almost forgotten the feeling of being unseen, of wondering if anyone would ever believe in him. He realized then why her eyes had stopped him outside. They reminded him of his own from long ago, the eyes of someone who had known hardship but had not yet surrendered to it. Elena finished her meal slowly, setting down the spoon with careful hands. She looked at him at last, her eyes shining not from tears this time but from something harder to define. "I don't know why you did this for me," she said quietly. "But, thank you." David gave a small smile, the kind that rarely touched his lips. "Sometimes," he said, "people just need someone to look at them and see more than what the world says they are." The words sank deep into the silence between them. She didn't reply, but she didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Outside, the night continued as usual. Cars rushed past, lights blinked, and strangers hurried along the sidewalks. But inside that corner of the restaurant, something small yet powerful had shifted. Two lives, one of wealth and one of struggle, had crossed paths in a way neither had expected. And though neither of them knew it yet, that quiet dinner was only the beginning of something far greater than a shared meal. It was the start of a story that would change them both. The night after their meeting stayed in David's mind longer than he expected. For years, his life had been built on routines, meetings, contracts, dinners in fine restaurants, and decisions worth millions. He was a man who planned, calculated, and controlled every detail. But that evening, With a single question from a stranger, "May I have your leftovers, sir?" His thoughts refused to settle. He kept seeing Elena's eyes, the quiet strength in them, the way she carried dignity even in hardship. Days passed, and though he tried to bury himself in business, the memory tugged at him. He wasn't a man easily distracted, yet here he was, thinking about her while sitting in boardrooms and while driving home in his expensive car. Something about that night had unsettled the walls he had built around himself. For Elena, the dinner had been a small miracle in itself. She had eaten well that night, her hunger eased for the first time in weeks. But more than the food, it was the way he had looked at her, not with disgust, not with pity, but as if she was worth listening to. That feeling lingered, warming her on nights when she curled up in the small corner she called shelter. Yet, as much as it comforted her, she didn't allow herself to hope too much. Kindness, she knew, was rare, and life often gave with one hand only to take with the other. But fate has a way of weaving paths again. A week later, David found himself near the same part of town. Normally he would not notice the streets beyond the tinted glass of his car, but this time he asked his driver to stop. He stepped out and walked the sidewalk, ignoring the curious looks of people who recognized his face. He wasn't sure why he was there, perhaps curiosity, perhaps something deeper, but he found himself searching. He saw her sitting on a bench near a dim streetlight, clutching her coat tighter around her shoulders. She looked smaller in the cold, yet still carried that quiet resilience. When she noticed him, her eyes widened in surprise, then quickly dropped, as if she felt she had no right to be seen by him again. "You're here," he said simply, his voice calm. She gave a faint nod, her words hesitant. "I didn't think I would ever see you again." "I wasn't sure either," he admitted. "But I couldn't forget." Her lips pressed together as she looked at him carefully, unsure of his intentions. "Why?" she finally asked. "I was just a stranger asking for food." "Why would you remember?" David paused, considering his answer. "Because you reminded me of something I almost forgot, that success means nothing if you can't see the people who have less." She said nothing, but her eyes softened slightly. For a moment, silence stretched between them again, the same silence that had spoken louder than words the first night. David sat beside her on the bench, the sharp cold biting at his tailored suit, but he didn't care. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what did you do before life turned this way?" Her gaze drifted, her thoughts reaching back to days that seemed far away. "I used to work in an office. Nothing big, just a clerk. I kept records, typed reports. It wasn't much, but it was steady. I could take care of myself and my mother. She was sick for a long time, and the medicine was expensive. I worked double shifts sometimes. But then the company downsized. I was one of the first to go. With no savings, no family to lean on, and debts growing, everything fell apart faster than I thought it could." Her voice cracked slightly, though she fought to keep it steady. "I tried to find work. I tried so hard. But when you don't have clean clothes, when you don't have an address to write down, people don't want to listen. After a while, you stop being seen." David listened, his face unreadable, but inside, her words struck him deeply. He knew about fighting for survival, though his story had ended differently. He thought about the early years of his career, when he had knocked on doors that were slammed in his face, when he had been told he wasn't enough. But he had been given chances, mentors, breaks, lucky turns. Without them, he might not have been sitting where he was today. "You're not invisible to me," he said at last, his voice low but firm. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. There it was again, the unspoken understanding, the connection that neither of them could explain. The turning point of their story began in that moment. David, a man who once defined life by numbers and success, made a decision that surprised even himself. He reached into his coat pocket, not for money, but for a small card. He handed it to her. "This is my office," he said. "Come tomorrow morning. Ask for me." Her hand trembled as she held the card, staring at the name printed in bold letters. She knew who he was now. She had heard his name in news stories, seen it on billboards and in magazines. He was the kind of man who didn't have time for people like her, the kind of man whose world was unreachable. And yet, here he was, offering her a place in it. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why would you?" "Because I see someone who's worth more than scraps," he interrupted gently. "You asked for leftovers, but I think you deserve a chance." Elena's eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back. She clutched the card to her chest, torn between gratitude and disbelief. I I don't know if I can. I don't even have clothes for something like that." He gave a small smile. "We'll take care of that. Just show up." For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt a flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. She nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling into her heart. That night, as she curled up in her corner of the world, the card still clutched in her hand, she whispered a prayer she hadn't dared to speak in a long time. Not for riches, not even for comfort, just for strength to take this chance. And in his mansion, far from the cold streets, David sat by the window, his thoughts restless. He had made countless decisions in his life, some worth millions. But this simple act of handing her a card felt like the most important choice he had made in years. Neither of them knew exactly what awaited. But both sensed that something had shifted. Their lives, once separated by worlds, were now tied together by a single moment of courage, her courage to ask, and his courage to answer differently. The next morning was unlike any other Elena had faced in years. Usually, mornings were a slow battle against the cold, her stomach twisting in emptiness, her mind occupied with the question of how to survive another day. But today was different. She woke before the sun rose, her hand still clutching the small card David had given her. She looked at it again and again, her heart racing with both hope and fear. It almost felt unreal. What if it was a trick? What if she went there, and they laughed at her, turning her away? What if she wasn't enough? The doubts tried to drown her, whispering that she didn't belong anywhere near a place like his office. But another voice, quiet but firm, told her she had nothing left to lose. She did her best to tidy herself. She brushed her hair with her fingers, wiped the dust from her coat, and tried to make her shoes look less worn. They were still old, her clothes still thin, but she lifted her chin high. If she was going to take the step, she would take it with dignity. The building was tall, its glass walls reflecting the morning sun. People in suits rushed in and out, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. Elena hesitated at the entrance, clutching the card tightly, her palms sweating. She almost turned away, but then she remembered the way David had looked at her, not with pity, but with belief. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. At the reception desk, the woman in a neat uniform looked at her with surprise, almost suspicion. "Can I help you?" she asked. Elena held out the card with trembling fingers. I was told to come here. I'm looking for Mr. David." The receptionist's eyes widened when she read the card. She glanced at Elena again, clearly unsure, but then picked up the phone. After a short conversation, she said, "Please wait here." Minutes felt like hours as Elena stood awkwardly in the shining lobby, surrounded by people who seemed so sure of themselves. But then the elevator doors opened, and David himself walked out. His presence immediately changed the air. He smiled faintly when he saw her, a smile that calmed her nerves. "You came," he said simply. Elena nodded. "I almost didn't. But I remembered your words." "Good," he replied. "That means you're stronger than you think." He led her upstairs, past curious glances from employees who wondered why their powerful boss was walking with a woman who looked so out of place. But David didn't care. He brought her into his office, a wide room with tall windows overlooking the city. For a moment, Elena felt overwhelmed. She had never been in a place like this, and part of her wanted to shrink back. But David's voice was steady, reassuring. "Elena, I want to offer you more than just food. I want to give you a chance to rebuild. I can't erase the past, but I can help with the present. Are you willing to try?" Her eyes filled with tears she fought hard to control. "Yes," she whispered. "I want to try. I don't want to live like this anymore." That day marked the beginning of her new journey. David arranged for her to have clean clothes, something simple yet professional, so she could step into the workplace with confidence. The first time she put them on, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked like someone who belonged, someone capable. It gave her a spark of hope she hadn't felt in years. Her first role was small assistant work, simple tasks like organizing files and answering calls. But to Elena, it was more than enough. It wasn't just a job, it was a doorway back to dignity. She showed up early, stayed late, and worked with quiet determination. She asked questions, learned quickly, and never complained. At first, some of the employees whispered behind her back, wondering why their boss had brought her into the company. But as days turned into weeks, they began to notice her effort, her discipline, and her kindness. Slowly, the whispers turned into respect. David, meanwhile, watched her progress with quiet pride. He checked in often, not to oversee, but to encourage. He gave her small challenges, each one a step to rebuild her confidence. And each time, Elena surprised him and herself by succeeding. But the journey was not without struggles. Some days, the weight of her past pressed heavily on her. She would look around at her co-workers, all so polished and confident, and feel like an outsider. Sometimes, the memories of the nights she had gone hungry would return, making her doubt whether she truly belonged in this new life. One evening, after a long day, she sat alone at her desk, tears threatening to fall. David found her there and asked softly, "What's wrong?" She shook her head. "I don't know if I can do this. I feel like I'm pretending, like any moment someone will realize I don't belong here." David sat across from her, his voice calm but firm. "Elena, listen to me. Everyone starts somewhere. I started with nothing too. I failed, I doubted myself, I heard people say I wouldn't make it. But I kept going. And so will you. You're not pretending you're growing." His words lit something inside her. She wiped her tears and nodded slowly. "I'll keep trying." From then on, she carried his words with her, a reminder that progress was not about being perfect but about moving forward despite the fear. Months passed, and Elena's life began to transform. She found a small apartment, modest but warm, a place she could finally call her own. She filled it with little things: a second-hand lamp, a small plant by the window, books she borrowed from the library. Each item felt like a victory, proof that she was rebuilding piece by piece. Her relationship with David grew too. It was not built on wealth or power, but on trust and respect. He didn't see her as someone to be pitied, and she didn't see him as just a man of money. They began to see each other as two people whose paths had crossed for a reason. One afternoon, as they walked out of the office together, Elena looked at him and said softly, "You know, the night I asked you for your leftovers. I thought you'd give me a bag of food and walk away. I never imagined it would lead to this." David smiled. "Neither did I. But sometimes, the smallest questions open the biggest doors." Her heart swelled with gratitude. For the first time in a long time, she didn't just see survival ahead of her, she saw a future. The miracle wasn't just that she had been given food or even a job. The real miracle was that someone had believed in her when she no longer believed in herself. And that belief was helping her rebuild not only her life, but also her spirit. The months that followed brought changes Elena never thought possible. Each day at the office felt like another step away from the shadows of her past and closer to a new life filled with light. She worked hard, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she wanted to prove to herself that she could stand again. Every phone call she answered, every file she organized, and every task she completed carried the weight of her determination. One morning, as she entered the office, one of her co-workers smiled at her warmly. That simple gesture made her heart swell. Not long ago, people barely noticed her existence. Now, she was part of a team, respected not because David had brought her in but because she had earned her place. Her confidence grew, though she never forgot the struggles she had faced. The hunger, the cold nights, the feeling of being invisible, they remained in her memory, but instead of breaking her, they reminded her of how far she had come. She often thought back to the moment she stood outside the restaurant, shivering and desperate, asking for leftovers. That one question had opened a door she didn't even know existed. David, too, was changing. His life had once been measured by profit margins, stock prices, and business deals. He had been respected, even admired, but deep inside, he had felt a kind of emptiness he rarely admitted. Meeting Elena had awakened something he didn't know he was missing. It reminded him that true wealth was not only about what he had achieved but also about what he could give. He began to look at his work differently. Instead of focusing only on numbers, he started thinking about people, the employees who built his company, the families they supported, and the lives that could be changed with opportunities. Elena's presence had reshaped his perspective. One evening, after a long day, Elena was invited to join a small gathering at David's company. It was a celebration of a new project launch. Standing among well-dressed guests, she felt nervous at first. But as she listened to David introduce her as one of the hardest-working members of his team, her nerves melted into pride. Applause filled the room, and for the first time in years, she stood tall, no longer hiding in the background. Later that night, when most people had gone home, Elena stood by the tall windows in David's office, looking out at the city lights. David joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. He handed one to her and asked softly, "What are you thinking about?" She smiled faintly, her eyes still on the glowing skyline. "I'm thinking about how different life looks from here. For so long, I looked at this city from the streets below, feeling like it had no place for me. But now, it feels like maybe I belong after all." "You do," David said firmly. "And don't ever forget that." She turned to him, her eyes glistening. "I never thought anyone would believe in me again. You gave me that gift." He shook his head slightly. "No, Elena. You gave yourself that gift. I just opened the door, you had the courage to walk through it." His words stayed with her. Over time, she realized he was right. While David's kindness had changed her path, it was her own strength and determination that had carried her forward. That realization filled her with a deep sense of pride. As seasons changed, Elena's life blossomed. She moved into a brighter apartment, decorated with little touches of her personality. She bought new clothes, not to impress, but to feel comfortable and confident. She even began to volunteer at a local shelter, offering encouragement to others who were struggling as she once had. She would tell them gently, "I know how it feels. But I promise you, this isn't the end." Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change everything. David often accompanied her on those visits, quietly supporting her mission. Seeing her help others filled him with a kind of joy he had never felt through business successes. He realized that the true miracle had not been in what he gave to her, but in what she had brought back into his life: compassion, meaning, and a renewed sense of purpose. One afternoon, as they walked through the park together, Elena stopped near a bench, the same kind of bench where David had first found her weeks after their meeting. She sat down and looked at him with a soft smile. "Do you realize how much has changed since that night?" she asked. David sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "Yes. And I think about it often." A single question turned into a journey neither of us expected. Elena nodded. "When I asked you for your leftovers, I wasn't just asking for food. I was asking life for a reason to keep going. And somehow, life answered through you." Her words struck him deeply. He reached for her hand, not out of formality but out of genuine connection. "And through you, life reminded me what really matters. I thought I had everything, but I was wrong. I didn't have the sense of meaning until you showed me." They sat there in silence for a while, the world moving on around them. For Elena, the silence was no longer heavy with shame or fear, it was full of peace. For David, it was a silence that reminded him of the miracle that had unfolded from a single act of listening. In time, Elena rose to new heights in the company. She took on bigger responsibilities, her skills growing with each challenge. People admired her not just for her work but for her kindness and humility. Many who worked with her never knew the full story of her past, but they could see the strength in her character. One evening, as she closed her office door, she paused and whispered to herself, "I made it." Not because she had riches or luxury, but because she had dignity, purpose, and a future she once thought was lost forever. The story of Elena and David became more than a tale of charity. It was a story of two lives changed, one who gained a chance to stand again, and one who rediscovered the true meaning of wealth. The miracle was not in the money, not even in the job. The miracle was in the moment two strangers looked into each other's eyes and truly saw one another. That single glance had broken through walls of fear, pride, and loneliness. From that night on, neither of them would ever be the same.